What's up, guys? Welcome back to another daily Bible reading Snapshot podcast, where this week we're studying the book of Judges, the book of Ruth, and the book of Luke. Now, we've said this before, but the book of Judges is probably one of the darkest periods in Israel's history, only to be paralleled really by the exile in the time when the Israelites were kicked out of their land by the Assyrians and the Babylonians later on, about 600 years later. But this is a horrible time period. Like, if you're going to pick the time when you wanted to be in Israel, it would not be during the time of the Judges. It is a constant spiral into sin, constant issues, constant leadership problems, and really it's a good parable for what happens when people do whatever they want. It's a constant refrain in the book. We're going to read it multiple times. In fact, as we get to the end of the book in chapter 17, 18, 19, 20, and 21, we're going to see this repeated refrain that says, there was no king in Israel, and then it goes on to talk about what it's going to say. But the point is, there's no king, i.e., what they're doing is done without the leadership of someone who has their best interest at heart, and it's done without the leadership of God directly through a king. And now a king doesn't solve everything, but certainly it sets us up for the need for a righteous monarchy that we'll find out about in the book of Samuel. But that's next week. This week, starting in Judges chapter 8, or really even just before that, it's important to kind of remember the movements in the book of Judges. It starts out with Othniel, then it goes to Ehud, then it goes to Deborah and Barak, then into Gideon. Gideon's the fourth real cycle of sin, and it's the fourth part of this book. And there's only a couple more after that. So it's Gideon, and then all the stuff that takes place with his family versus the Midianites and versus other people in Israel. Then the story will catalog what Jephthah does as he fights against the Ammonites in the east, and then what Samson does fighting against the Philistines in the western coast. And then the last part of the book of Judges is really not about any particular judges. It's just about how the people of Dan, some people from Bethlehem, and some people from Benjamin start massive problems in the country that leads to a civil war where Israel and all the tribes fight against the tribe of Benjamin. So jumping back into our text in Judges chapter 8, we find the end of the story of Gideon. He defeats his enemies. He has authority from God over these Midianites. And there's an irony there because in chapter 8, verse 22, he is said to be put in charge, and the people say, you should have your son rule over us. You need to rule over us, and your son should rule over us. And Gideon says, no. I'm not going to rule over you. My sons aren't going to rule over you. But then in the next chapter, one of Gideon's sons says, I will rule over you. So it's a little bit of irony we see. Some good news is that the people enjoy 40 years of peace during Gideon's reign, even though it's not like he's a king. But as he's a judge, there's some stability. But he does commit one big sin. They take the gold that's offered to Gideon, and they make it into a golden ephod, and it says the people hoard after it in chapter 8, verse 27. And then the people later, it says they hoard after the Baals. So this graphic language of desire mixed with sin is used to describe how the people sought idolatry through this ephod. They bowed down and worshiped this image, and then how that led them to turn against God to other gods. That's another example of syncretism, which is we talked about last week. It's another example of how syncretism always ultimately leads to paganism and false practices and idolatry and things like that. So the next chapter, chapter 9, Abimelech is one of the sons of Gideon. And frankly, he's a bit power hungry because he wants to be in charge, and he kills 70 of his brothers. So Gideon had a lot of wives, a lot of sons, and Abimelech kills all of them except for one, the youngest son named Jotham. He escapes, but the men of Shechem turn against Abimelech. So first of all, the men of Shechem make them king or whatever. They anoint him as the leader and the ruler. They do call him king. And they turn against Abimelech at some point. And they go to war. So basically it's the men of Shechem against Abimelech after Abimelech was crowned as their king. So it says Abimelech and his men won that battle. They razed the city and sowed it with salt in chapter 9, verse 45, which is an expression that means total destruction. So some people wonder, what does it mean to sow something with salt? The idea is you are making it a wasteland. Just like the places in Israel that are sowed with salt are the wastelands. It's the deserts, the places even by the Dead Sea, even today. So then the people consolidate in this tower, and then Abimelech burns the tower down. And then Abimelech goes against the city of Thebes, and he almost destroys it. And then the people consolidate into a tower, and you might wonder as you're reading, Is he going to burn down the tower again? Well, this time, a woman drops an upper millstone, and it's about to kill Abimelech, right? He's dying, and he says, please, let one of you kill me, because I don't want to be killed by a woman, which we already saw that earlier in the book when Jael killed Sisera. We saw how God used the lady to humiliate this guy for being one of God's enemies. So Abimelech, bad guy, he's killed, and that is kind of the end of that story. And it says that God returned the evil of Abimelech and the evil of the men of Shechem back upon themselves at the end of that chapter. Then we get two more judges, Tola, who is a judge for 23 years, and Jair, who is a judge for 22 years. We don't find out much about them, but in chapter 10, the new rival power against the Israelites comes from the east, from the Ammonites. So the Ammonites are this people group that lives to the east of the Jordan River, and their problem, and there's an unlikely judge who kind of takes over that we'll read about, a guy named Jephthah. So the people of Israel were being oppressed because, again, they serve the Baals. And God said, you're going to suffer if you're not going to follow me. And in chapter 10, verse 16, it says that the people of Israel were willing to put away the foreign gods among them. And then they served the Lord. And he, that is the Lord, became impatient over the misery of Israel, which means God saw, it kind of sounds like Exodus 1, where God sees the oppression of his people, and he's impatient. It bothers him. So he raises up this judge named Jephthah. So who's Jephthah? Jephthah is one of the sons of a man named Gilead. He was a powerful man, and he had a lot of kids, just kind of like Gideon had a lot of kids. And one of his kids was with a prostitute, so not even a legitimate child of his, not same mom, same dad as the other brothers and sisters, and that's Jephthah. So he's the son of a prostitute and Gilead, and he's driven out of his region because brothers and sisters did not want him to be part of it. He was kind of a different sort of guy. He was a rough guy. It says he was driven out to the east, to the land of Tob, and he surrounded himself with all this bad group of people. These rough, like, gang member type people are all the people he made as friends. So Jephthah was out there, and he is the unlikely person because the people of Gilead are like, hey, Jephthah, hey, bro, I know we sent you out and I know we didn't want you, but we kind of need your help. You're the toughest guy around. And, he puts up a little bit of a fight because he's like, dude, what are you talking about? You sent me out. But yes, okay, I'll come and I'll serve you guys and I'll do what needs to be done. So then Jephthah gives a lesson to these Ammonites. They complain. They say, yeah, the reason we're fighting the Israelites is because they took land that didn't belong to them. And Jephthah gives them this big, long history lesson, which is really cool. In Judges 11, he describes what has happened in the 300 years since the Exodus. He even says it's been 300 years since all this happened. And he says it in verse 24, this is Judges 11:24, he says, will you not possess what Chemosh, your God, gives you to possess, and all that the Lord our God has dispossessed before us, we will possess. So again, what do we find out? It's your God versus my God. And he puts it that way. And then Jephthah leads these Israelites to this victory, but not before he makes a promise. Before he goes to battle, he promises God, I will sacrifice as a burnt offering whatever walks out of my house first. So maybe he's thinking, is it going to be a chicken or a cow or a bird? Whatever comes out of my house first, when I show up back at home, God, if you give me the victory, I will offer this as a burnt offering. I think it's important that you read that. As a burnt offering. This is a real sacrifice. And then what happens? God gives him the victory, and who walks out of the house first? It's not a chicken. It's not a cow. It's not, a lamb. It's his daughter. And this is known as Jephthah's rash vow because he promised to God that he would sacrifice as a burnt offering whatever exited his house first. And she doesn't fight back. She says, yes, do what you promised to the Lord. Only let me weep for my virginity. So that brings up a good question. People ask, did Jephthah really kill his daughter and offer her as a burnt offering? Well, there's some evidence that Israelites did do this at other occasions. We see in 2 Chronicles, one of the kings was doing this. So that's a problem. Also, this is a practice that was done in the land of Canaan. It's just the problem is, would one of God's people have done this and, not gotten in trouble? It doesn't seem like Jephthah gets in trouble for doing this. But part of it is the nature of the vow that he took. He promised he would do this, and then he was foolish, and he either sacrifices this daughter, as the text seems to say, or some people argue that he offered her to the Lord in the sense that he said, you can no longer live normal life. You're going to be a recluse. You can't get married. You can't have a family. You're just going to be separate from people. I think people would like to believe that's the case because that seems like what God would have wanted him to do. But the text doesn't really lead us in that direction. The text seems to say, because he said, I'm going to offer this offering as a burnt offering, seems like that's what he did. And it's confusing, right? Like, did God want him to do this? Could God have not intervened and said no? Like, I suppose God could have done that, but this was a time of serious evil and confusion. And like, Jephthah, is he a good guy or a bad guy? Well, that's kind of hard to answer that question. Like, he does some good things, but he's not a good guy. It's not somebody, again, you wouldn't want him as your best friend. He's probably not that kind of guy. And a really sad thing that happens here in chapter 11. And then chapter 12, he fights against the Ephraimites. The men of Gilead fight against the men of Ephraim, and they have this word Shibboleth that they're supposed to say that the Ephraimites couldn't pronounce. They would pronounce the word Sibboleth, and it was a test to see if you're from Ephraim or from Gilead, and that led to 42,000 Ephraimites dying. So remember, now we've got civil war type stuff happening. This is Israel versus Israel. This is not good. Then we find out about 3 more judges. Ibzan reigns for 7 years. Elon reigns for 10 years. And Abdon reigns for 8 years. Really, we only get a couple verses about them. Then Samson, very famous character in the Bible. Samson does his campaign against the Philistines. So remember, we were just focused on the people to the east. Now we're focused on the people to the west, the Philistines. So there's a very unique birth prediction here. Again, to a barren woman, which this happens a lot. There's people in the Bible where God says this woman is barren, but a very important son is going to come from this barren woman. This lady was the wife of Manoah. We don't actually get her name, but Manoah is there, and the angel of the Lord shows up. And when's the last time the angel of the Lord showed up in our text? The last time was during the time of Joshua, right? So the angel of the Lord's not showing up all the time, but he shows up to Manoah, and he explains that this son that they're going to have is going to be important. And he's going to be a Nazirite, which takes us back to Numbers chapter 6, that he's going to do certain things and not do certain things out of complete devotion to God. So his whole life is going to be about being devoted to God. Then Samson is born, and it says the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him. So the military feats that Samson does to kill a bunch of people are said to be inspired by the Spirit of the Lord. Very interesting. It's not what the Spirit of the Lord is going to inspire you to do as a Christian who is very clearly in the New Testament teaching us to be sanctified and set apart from the world and teaching us to do what's right and good. The Spirit of the Lord was doing things at this time because of their situation that I think is a little different than what he wants us to do. But we see his work is true. It's active. He's making Samson go and fight these Philistines. But then Samson makes a lot of bad decisions, and that's what you should know about Samson. He is famous for making bad decisions. He, first of all, wants to marry a Philistine girl from the city of Timnah, and that's not a good thing because these Philistines do not serve the Lord. And he wants to marry her. And even his parents warn him, like, dude, I don't know if this is a good idea. You're a Nazirite. You're one of God's people. Like, I don't think we should do this. But he says, no, she's good in my eyes. Which Samson involves himself with 3 different women, and all 3 women are bad. All 3 women are pagans. But all 3 women clearly were attractive to Samson, and that's his weakness. Women were his weakness. So he's about to marry this Philistine girl, but in his arrogance, he challenges the Philistines with a riddle with a bet attached to it. And his future wife demands to know the answer because the Philistines are like, you should get an answer from him, and she wears him down, and he finally gives the answer to the riddle. She goes to the Philistines. They answer the riddle, and one of the most, harsh, intense disses and one-liners in the whole Bible comes in Judges 14:18, where Samson, in anger towards the Philistines, this is a big yikes moment in the Bible here. It is something that Samson replies back to these people. He says, "If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have known my riddle." There's a lot going on to that sentence, and it is not good in any way to Samson or to these people or to this woman. And anyway, then Samson gets mad. He goes to Ashkelon, which is a Philistine city, killed 30 men, takes their tunics, pays off the bet, comes back to Timnah, but guess what? The bride was given away. So he grabs 300 foxes, lights them on fire, sends them throughout the Philistine fields. Then the Philistines, instead of getting mad at Samson, they get mad at the wife, the soon-to-be wife of Samson, and her dad, and then they burn that house down with fire. So then Samson gets mad at them, gets revenge, and he kills tons of them. Then the Philistines attack this Judean city called Lehi. Samson gets kind of captured by the Judeans. At least there's this confrontation, and Samson's like, yeah, tie me up, send me back to these people. And then God loosened the ropes. Samson grabbed a jawbone of a donkey and killed 1,000 men. So wild stuff going on. Is Samson good or bad? Right? Well, not good. Like, this is not a good time in Israel's history, and he's certainly not doing a bunch of good things, although he is fighting for the Lord, but he is probably not the character that you want to be like. Then in chapter 16, we get more drama, 2 more women. First is a prostitute in Gaza who Samson is allured by, and they try to set up this ambush to kill Samson, because at this point, Samson is a danger to the national interest of the Philistines. Like, he is not safe to stay alive. So they try to ambush him. He pulls out the gates of the city by the posts and carries these like massive 2-story doors 40 miles up a hill from Gaza up to Hebron. Like, this is superhuman strength. And that makes the Philistines even more scared. And then another girl enters the picture, Delilah. Delilah is bribed by the rulers of the Philistines with silver to find out the secret of Samson's great strength and to take him down. And after multiple tests and multiple times that Samson should have, like, I don't know, dude, wake up. She's not that pretty, right? Just, you do not want to be with this girl. Do not get with a bad girl. It is going to be bad news for you. And for Samson, he consents, and he finally tells Delilah the secret, and then the Philistines shave his head, and he has no more strength, and it says that he did not know that the Lord had left him. That's Judges 16:20. A couple verses later, after all this takes place and Samson has his eyes gouged out and he goes to the temple of Dagon to be the entertainment for the guests, it says the hair of his head began to grow again. Very interesting. Then the people in this worship center in the temple of Dagon in Gaza were so excited because they said, our God has given our enemy into our hand. So you start to invoke Yahweh versus the foreign gods. That starts to get the Lord's attention. And Samson prayed to the Lord and said, God, help me one more time take down the Philistines. And it says there was many who died in his death that then he killed while he was alive. So Samson brings the house down, so to speak, fills the 2 pillars, pushes them over, knocks this whole place down, and he essentially dies in this too. He commits suicide, but he also kills 3,000 people along with him. So again, good or bad thing, right? Well, the judgment of the Lord against idolaters is clearly seen. He is fighting these people who are doing wrong. And he's using people like Samson, who are not righteous or blameless or perfect people, but he's using them to do it. So that leads to the end of the book. Chapter 17 through 21 contains 2 major scenes. One of them has to do with a guy named Micah and his Levite priest, and has to do with idolatry and the tribe of Dan. And then the other has to do with the civil war that takes place against the tribe of Benjamin. So scene number 1, Micah is a guy who makes this metal shrine and metal image, and he worships it. And this Levite came from Bethlehem, and Micah's like, you should be a priest for me. And he's like, okay. And the text says, in those days there was no king in Israel. And in those days, the tribe of the people Dan was seeking for itself an inheritance to dwell in, for until then, no inheritance among the tribes of Israel had fallen to them. So the tribe of Dan's like, we want a place to be. They keep getting knocked around. So they go to this little city in the north called Laish, which when you hear people say geographical markers in Israel, like from Dan to Beersheba, they're talking about from the north to the south. So Dan took this city. It was the far most northern point of Israel. They take over the city, and with 600 men, they basically capture the city of Laish. They kill everybody in the town. They set up a new worship center up there with this image, And this priest, who was a Levite, he's called Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Moses. So we find out this is not just any Levite. This is a descendant of Moses, which should make us all step back and say, wow, how far can a family fall when they walk away from serving the Lord with their whole heart? Like, how far can Moses' family fall? Well, really far. That leads us to chapter 19 to 21, the civil war against Benjamin. Again, it starts out by saying there was no king in Israel. And there was a Levite who had a concubine. They were visiting family, and the dad kept trying to keep him at the house for a long time. And finally, they're like, okay, we got to go. But they didn't want to stay in the city of Jerusalem because those were the Jebusites. So they stayed in the town called Gibeah, which was a Benjaminite town. And as you read this, you might think, man, I think I've read this before. Well, you've read a story that's almost exactly the same in Genesis 18 and 19, where the city of Sodom is described, where there's this righteous person that comes into the town who is shown good hospitality by one person, and the men of the town come to try to rape the guy who shows up into the town. And that's what they did again. Just like what happened in Sodom happens in this Benjaminite town, which again, you should read that knowing Genesis 18, saying, these are God's chosen people? Really? These are the people who got the covenants and the promises, and they got the book of Deuteronomy. Look what can happen in a short period of time from all these Israelites who are excited at Mount Sinai saying, we'll serve the Lord, to at the conquest saying, we will serve the Lord. And then all of a sudden, it's like Sodom and Gomorrah. That didn't take very long, right? It's a good lesson for how sin works. So this man, again, selfishly, wrongly, sends his concubine out to be violated until she's killed. Then he, after she's dead, his concubine, one time he's called his wife, after she's dead, he takes this lady, who's his wife, his concubine, cuts her up in 12 pieces, sends, I would assume, like a foot or part of a leg or part of her hand or her arm to all these different tribes and says, it's time to go to war against Benjamin. They are perverse. This is like Sodom. This is horrible. So Israel was summoned, and they surrounded this town of Gibeah. It says there were 26,000 men of Benjamin versus 400,000 men of Israel. So this is not a fair fight, but the Benjaminites hold off for a really long time, but eventually they fall. 600 men are left of Benjamin. They fled to the rock of Rimmon, and they stayed there for 4 months, and they did not die. But the problem at this point is one tribe has been wiped out. What do we do? A whole tribe of Israel has been wiped out. So they say, well, there needs to be wives for these men to perpetuate this tribe of Israel. Yet we all made a promise before the Lord saying, these Benjaminites are so wrong, we'll never give our daughters in marriage to the men of Benjamin. So they're like, what do we do? So they looked around and they said, was there any town that did not send men to fight with us? Oh, there was a town. It was the town of Jabesh Gilead. And they said, great, let's take over that town. So the Israelites take out this town, one of their own, kill all the men, kill all the married women, and they take all the young girls, the people who hadn't been married yet, so teenagers and below, all of those girls, they say, great, those are going to be the wives for Benjamin. And this is a rough, bad, horrible time. But the problem is there's only 400 girls. There's 200 more guys that need to find a wife at some point. So what are we going to do? So they devised this plan to attack and kidnap girls from the town of Shiloh. Like, that's where the Ark of the Lord is. They kidnap 200 girls from Shiloh and then convince all their families, like, please allow this to happen. You didn't give your daughters in marriage. They were kidnapped into marriage, so let it happen because we need Benjamin to be a tribe. We can't let this tribe die out. And all that horrible kidnapping and enslaving and fighting and civil war leads to the last verse of the book where it says, in those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Which sometimes we hear that phrase, and it's so disconnected from the context that we're like, yeah, sometimes people do bad things when they don't have anybody watching. It's like, no, this is what happens in a society, in a nation, in a family, in a person's life. This is what happens. This is how bad sin can get. It can start out with just not focusing on God and his word and not reading the Bible. And then all of a sudden, we've got homosexuality, we have rape, we have kidnapping, we have all this stuff, and we have war, we have violence, all because it started out with God's people who had God's promises, who ended up saying, I don't want to do what God says. Like, sin is more powerful than we give it credit for. And that's the book of Judges. That's why Judges is such a bad and scary and sobering book. That all leads to the next book, the book of Ruth, which is a good book, but it happens during the time of the Judges. So it's almost as if Judges is purely bad and it gets worse and worse, and it just shows us, hey, it's not everybody though. There are some people who are seeking God. There are some people who are doing what's right, and the book of Ruth tells us in a quick 4-chapter story all about that. So Ruth, what's happening here? It says it's written during the time of the Judges. It's a story, a real story about Ruth, who comes from the land of Moab, and Ruth's mother-in-law named Naomi. She's kind of the main character. Naomi and Ruth are the main characters of this book. And first of all, Naomi is from Israel. Her and her husband, she and her husband, Elimelech, they move to the land of Moab. They take foreign wives for their sons, and then all 3 men die. So dad and 2 sons die. So Naomi is a widow, Ruth is a widow, and Orpah is a widow. Naomi says to Orpah and Ruth both, like, go back to the Moabites, go back to your father's house, go back, do whatever, remarry, I'm going back to Israel. And Orpah says, okay, I'll do that. But it says Ruth clung to Naomi, and she said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. That is probably the strongest statement of loyalty, human loyalty, that we see in the entire Bible, right there. And it's from Ruth to a pretty undeserving woman named Naomi. So they travel back to Bethlehem, where Naomi was from, where Elimelech had his land, and Ruth gets to know a guy named Boaz because she works in his field. Boaz has a good reputation. He's a good, solid guy. Ruth also has a good reputation, and Boaz and Ruth even have a conversation where Boaz says, I know what you've done. I know that you have decided to follow the Lord and be a support for Naomi, and your good reputation precedes you. So all that is really good, but Naomi has a plot. She wants to get Boaz to fall for Ruth, and in my opinion, as you read the story, I think Naomi is trying to get Boaz to sin. And that's how it's described. And Boaz and Ruth are both more righteous than Naomi in this story. And Boaz and Ruth are all about a romantic relationship, but they're about doing it the right way. Another interesting thing, the thing that attracted Ruth to Boaz and Boaz to Ruth was their godliness. It was the fact that they wanted to do what God wanted to do. It's an important lesson about, finding someone to marry is, you need to be attracted to their godliness. And if you're not attracted to their godliness, then you're probably not a very godly person. And Ruth and Boaz both do that. They go about things the right way because Boaz was a redeemer, which meant he had to take on the land responsibilities and the responsibility to take on the widow, which would be Ruth. So there was another redeemer that was closer to the family of Ruth, and he declines. He says, hey, I can't do that. It'll mess up the inheritance for my kids. So Boaz and Ruth get married happily ever after. They have a son named Obed, who becomes a joy to his grandmother Naomi. And Obed has a son named Jesse, and Jesse has a son named David. So some people ask, what's the point of this book? Well, I think it's to show there are righteous people that are left. And this is to show King David, God's leader, the one who's going to get the covenants and the promises and the Messiah line, like the lineage of the Messiah, that King David, he comes from a good family, and this is his family, and this is how they came to be. So Ruth, little book, but an important book. Now, turning to the Gospel of Luke in the New Testament, we see more things that Jesus is doing to prove who he is, and that's really the key. He calms a storm. He drives out a demon. He heals a bleeding woman. He raises Jairus' daughter, and it's all about who is Jesus? Well, he's the Messiah, prophesied about in the Old Testament. I mean, even Herod asks, who is he? And then he preaches the kingdom, and he feeds 5,000. So Jesus is showing people, I am the one who's prophesied in the Old Testament. Then it gets to a turning point in the book where Jesus, after prayer, which is another thing that happens in Luke all the time, Jesus goes and prays and then goes and does something important. He asks his disciples, who do you say that I am? And when Peter says, you're the Christ, you're the Son of the living God, then it's a turning point. Jesus starts to get very specific about his identity and about his mission and about discipleship. So he says important things like this. Luke 9:23, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. For what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses or forfeits himself? Right? He gets super specific here about what it means to be a disciple. Then the transfiguration. I mean, all the things that happen right after this are Jesus correcting his disciples, right? He corrects their wrong view of him. He tells them, I'm going to die and I'm going to rise again. So he corrects their wrong view of the kingdom. Then he does the transfiguration, which shows them, hey, this is who I really am. Then the disciples try to heal a boy, but they're not able to. And Jesus corrects them by healing this boy. Then he foretells his death and resurrection again. Then the disciples argue who's the greatest. And Jesus corrects them again and says, the one who receives this child in my name, that's the greatest. Then he corrects the disciples for being critical about people who claim to be with Jesus but weren't a part of their group. Then he corrects them again. James and John want to call fire down from heaven, and he corrects them. And then he corrects these people who come along and say, I'll follow you wherever you go. And Jesus says, foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. He says at the end of that passage in Luke 9:62, no one who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God. So he's telling us this is what it means to be a disciple. He's even correcting our wrong thinking about being a disciple. So he sends out the 72. He sends out people to work and to do ministry. They return, and he's like, dude, it's awesome that you're working for me. It's awesome that the spirits are subject to you, but you should rejoice in an even greater way that your names are written in heaven. It's such a good thing that God has chosen to reveal himself to you disciples. Then a lawyer tries to test Jesus, and he says, how do I get saved? How do I go to the kingdom of God? How does this all happen? He's like, well, you got to do what the law says. How do you read it? Well, love God and love your neighbors yourself. And it says he was desiring to justify himself, and he said, well, then who's my neighbor, right? Who do I really have to love as myself? And that leads to the parable of the Good Samaritan, where Jesus shows that your neighbor is the one who's in front of you that needs your help. And that's what it means to love your neighbor as yourself. Then more correction takes place with Mary and Martha, where Mary is not serving in the way that Martha is, and Martha is critical of her sister, and Jesus says, no, Mary's chosen the better portion. What is the better portion? To sit at Jesus' feet and be his disciple. Like, that's what this whole section of chapters is all about. What does it mean to be Jesus' disciple? Mary's chosen to do discipleship stuff. That's always good. Then chapter 11, Jesus teaches his disciples how to pray. They say, hey, teach us to pray, like John taught his disciples. And then he gives some examples of, hey, if you're asking a friend for bread, you better have boldness to get results. Oh, and by the way, if you're asking a father for food, just know that he cares for you. And that's how you should pray. Pray boldly and pray knowing that the one that you pray to actually cares. And then the end of chapter 11, Jesus talks to the outsiders, so to speak. He casts out demons and describes how he does that not by Satan's power, but because the kingdom of God has come upon them. And he gives some teaching about what happens when demons return, which is interesting. You can read about that. And then he talks about how bad it is to not obey him and to not repent and respond. He says that even the people of Nineveh and the queen of Sheba from 1 Kings, they're going to rise up at the judgment saying, we had such little knowledge, yet we sought God. But you guys have Jesus, and you still don't embrace them. And then he turns against the Pharisees and scribes while he is at a dinner with the Pharisees. Jesus is so bold here to correct. And there's so much we learned this week about Jesus. There's so much we learn about being a disciple. And this is a great time for you to dig in and say, what is Jesus teaching me? What do I need to be corrected by? I mean, that's the first thing he does with his disciples, is he just starts correcting them, correcting wrong thoughts, correcting wrong ideas, correcting wrong assumptions about what the Christian life will be like. I think as we read the Gospel of Luke and we understand who Jesus is, we're benefited greatly if we come to it with an attitude of humility that we have wrong thoughts about discipleship too. Even if you're a well-taught Christian, sometimes our ideas about what the Christian life are less than what Jesus says, and it's not. We need to have our thoughts corrected by Jesus here through God's word. So a lot we're reading this week. I hope you enjoy it. Hope you dig into it. And we'll see you back next week for another daily Bible reading Snapshot podcast.